lots of violent sex involved. There was strangulation involved. It was not supposed to go as far as it did, but it did. I don't distinguish between murder and anything else. She died, I did it. What else you want to know?
This is Charlie Manson kind of stuff. What's going on here?
We have been told that you can grant wishes, and the wishes that you can grant have to be paid for with a life. I can't make that up.
And me and Bailey have killed several people.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting concept. Trust me, you've never had a conversation with a guy like me.
Sydney Loof was meeting up for a date with someone she met online and hasn't been seen since. She was last heard from last Wednesday when she sent a photo on Snapchat. It was captioned, "Ready for my date."
Good morning, Lincoln and Omaha and probably several other places. This is Aubrey Trail and this is Bailey Boswell. We've spent the last few days watching ourselves being slammed and crucified in the newspapers and the news and everything else, so we thought it was time we had our say. The Lincoln Police Department will have you believe that I'm still just a criminal running around. But you know, as far as I know, I'm not wanted for anything. I mean, naturally, I can't go home now because my house has been swarmed, searched, and I'm being looked for.
The most unusual thing about it is it's almost like they're holding their own press conference. Their choice to go public and then use like a social media broadcast sort of to do it, rather than getting an attorney and going in and talking to the police. They're going to speak directly to the public and say, we're just innocent and we're being maligned. And with psychopathy, it's usually linked to that sense of they're going to be in control. They're not going to let someone else send information out or control the message. They want to have a say to control our attention and what we think about them.
Bailey here is going to tell you about her 2 dates with Sydney, and we'll go from there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bailey, Audrey on Tinder, and a few other names because I have warrants, but this really isn't about me. This is about Sydney. And I'm just kind of want to tell you what I've already told the Lincoln police more than one time. I met her. We drove around Lincoln, smoked weed, had a great time, and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house, so I did so. I mean, I haven't heard from her since.
Boswell has like the hood up and the big, almost glamour Hollywood glasses. She doesn't seem to want to show her full face and say, I'm an innocent person. So it might be in the vein of creating an image like Bonnie and Clyde or something. I just think it's odd if they're getting online to clear their name and then to be so covered up.
I really don't even know what else to say. I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl. I don't know. Babe, do you have anything else to say?
They're chasing us around like dogs. I wish the family the best. I wish Sydney the best. But as far as the police department, you.
Yeah.
Have you sit right over there? All right, let's party. We want to make sure you know why you're here. I think based upon us looking at the Facebook stuff, the videos, it's pretty clear, but you never know. Sometimes people say say one thing when they're on a video camera and another thing it's like,
No. Go ahead.
So at some point, somebody's going to ask us what you think. Because we flew down here from Lincoln this morning. We're going to spend as much time as we need to with you.
Okay.
But what I think comes down to what I know. And I can't say I know a whole lot about you. I know what I can read in the NCIC reports and the intelligence reports coming out of jail and what some of the girls have told us and stuff like that. But I'd like to talk to you a bit about how you're raised and who raised you and kind of work through that. I'd be happy to tell you about myself too a little bit if you want to, but it's important for me to understand who you are. I'd like to give kind of an idea of who you are, where you've been, what you're about, so I kind of understand, because this conversation that we're about to have, I mean, there's a ton of people that are hanging on it, but what's more important to me is who you are.
Where do you want to start?
You start wherever you feel comfortable.
I was born in Manchester, Tennessee. Never graduated high school. Got in trouble when I was 17. Me and a friend had a wonderful idea to rob a motel with a BB gun. And I spent the next 11 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. I've been out of prison for 2.5 years. I own an antique business, so internet pretty much worldwide. In trouble most of my life, crook most of my life. No reason for it. If you're profiling or something, I didn't have a bad childhood. I wasn't abused. I chose to be a criminal. I mean, no excuses. It's just what I chose to be.
Aubrey Trail's criminal history includes a variety of crimes, a variety of categories of crimes, and with psychopathic individuals, one of the factors that we look at is what we call criminal versatility. While Trail told police that he was into the business of dealing and trading antiques, what we actually know is that while he was selling antiques, he was stealing those antiques and then putting them on the market. He was stealing gold coins and other coins of value and then selling those.
Something that's really important about psychopaths is they get immense pleasure from deceiving others. Conning others makes them feel great. Why? Because they feel superior, grandiose, they can lord it over you. When Aubrey comes and he says, let's party, it's extremely foolish. He's not taking this seriously, and he's glib and arrogant.
You ready to roll?
No, I got something for y'all. Y'all want something from me, I want something from y'all.
what do you want?
Do not judge me on my past. Do not look at my history and find me guilty already. Listen to what I have to say and investigate what I tell you. Here's how this will work.
Okay.
If you would like answers to your questions, me and Bailey will be in Wilbur County Jail tomorrow night. If I'm not back in Wilbur tomorrow, this conversation is over. Bailey's not going to ever say a word to you.
At this point, it's been 2 weeks since Sydney Loof went missing. Investigators have no leads. They're talking to Trail, trying to identify if this girl is even alive. But Trail's not worried about anything related to Sydney Loof. He is making attempts to control the interview. He's making attempts to control the investigation. And he's actually confident and arrogant enough to think he can negotiate with the detectives about where he's transferred, what happens to Bailey Boswell, what time frame those decisions need to be made in, and very confidently and smugly just says to them, this interview's over if that doesn't happen. With Sydney Loof, he's not concerned about her well-being, but he is using her as a pawn to negotiate his own terms.
I'd like to back up a little bit, if you don't mind, and talk about, because this relationship with Bailey is fairly unique.
I mean, I love her to death. I met Bailey over a year ago. How I met her doesn't really matter. But her and I hit it off. She was in a really, really bad situation. She has a stalker boyfriend, ex-boyfriend. Bailey is bisexual, you need to know that. Bailey likes females as much as she likes guys. I won't go into graphic details of our sex life and all that.
I need you to, it's unnecessary.
Because some of our stuff leans towards the extreme and Not in a violent, extreme way, but with toys and like that, you know. So there's a lot of role playing, dominant, submissive stuff.
The way Aubrey Trail talks about Bailey Boswell is this impression management that he's a hero, that will protect her, and he's very noble, and he's a good guy. And when you see this kind of age difference and you see dominant submission activities, that's typically a power imbalance. And the power imbalance can manifest in different ways, but it is an odd pairing that suggests something's not right.
While there isn't that much known about Bailey Boswell, in part because Trail had instructed her not to talk to law enforcement, it's important to note that the way those two met was Boswell actually posted an ad on a defunct sex site looking for a sugar daddy, and Trail responded. So the beginnings of their relationship as a couple was mutually transactional. And that gives us a little bit more information about Bailey Boswell, that she's maybe not this damsel in distress. She may not be this young female who has just been victimized, but herself has a more psychopathic presentation in that she's willing to use people and she knows what she needs out of people and she doesn't want a whole lot more.
We're going to talk about some of the girls that have started to come forward, if that's all right with you.
That's good.
Okay.
The information that we have is that you're kind of some all-powerful sort of fella. You're a spiritual type person.
Every one of the girls that we've talked to so far, they all said the same stuff. This is Charlie Manson kind of stuff. What's going on here?
We have been told that you can grant wishes, and the wishes that you can grant have to be paid for with a life. I can't make that up.
And me and Bailey have killed several people.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting concept. Trust me, you've never had a conversation with a guy like me. And it's no brag or boast. I don't really need to impress you. I don't need to impress anybody. And maybe what they're saying is true. I'm not saying it's not.
One of the things we talk about when we think of psychopathy is the cat and mouse, so the toying with people. He's going to say some very provocative things and then back away from some of the comments, and he's enjoying it. He's leaning back and relaxed. He's in charge of the interview at that particular point. The more we learn about him, it sounds like he was able to lure women in who either needed money or they liked some drugs, and he would invite them into his sphere where he seems to be the only dominant male and then is the provider, the grantor of wishes. It looks like a recruitment, seduction, and grooming sort of pattern where he's got Bailey Boswell helping him find women online and then to...
Could you bring me to where Sydney Loop is right now?
Right this very minute? No, I'm not sure where she's at right this very minute. So the answer would be no. Can I point you in the right direction? Absolutely.
Do you know whether or not she's alive or dead?
I would just say that I'm assuming she's alive.
You're going to tell me something? I'll tell you something.
Okay, you tell me that now and I'll tell you something else.
No, you're full of I'm not even full of Never full of okay.
Can't guarantee you. What I would have told you was a lot more important than what you would have told me.
After more than 2 weeks of endless searching for a missing Lincoln woman, her family took to Facebook to announce the news. The body of 24-year-old Sydney Loof has been recovered.
Police say her body had been dismembered and scattered across multiple rural sites 100 miles outside Lincoln. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell are now prime suspects in her murder.
Hello, Matt. Hello, Mike. Hi, Aubrey.
Y'all like to think that y'all came all this way just because you like me. That's probably not true. You're growing your hair out. Don't trust these barbers. You know, I have to keep my yard with looks. Keep them.
At this point in the investigation, Aubrey Trail has been transferred, and the same detectives have gone out to see him in Kansas. He comes in, he's social, he's pleasant, he's glib. And what we don't see is somebody who's stressed, he's not worried, he's not concerned about the fact that he is still very much under suspicion for the murder of Sidney Loof.
He's joking. We call that superficial charm in psychopathy because he doesn't really have a relationship with them. He is inappropriately making jokes. That's not why they're there to see him. But he's making light of it. And people with psychopathy do that. He's playing with them.
You know that I killed her.
So unequivocally, you are taking responsibility. You're saying what about Sidney Loof's death?
I am saying that I did it. The day she came to our house, Sidney was offered, shall we say, a fantasy to make money. She was given $5,000. And in the process of this fantasy, Sidney died. You know how Sidney died. Sidney was strangled.
Who strangled her?
I did.
What instrument was used to strangle her?
Extension cord.
Who else was in the room while she was having sex and being strangled?
That you'll never know. I will tell you no name.
Okay.
You get what I promised from the beginning, a life for a life.
Trail is not willing to talk about any real details. Why he killed her, who was in the room. Trail is still trying to control and steer the investigation. He's getting in front of what he thinks is the train and trying to make sure that Bailey Boswell is not implicated, to make sure that these other females that they pulled into this violent sex ring are not implicated.
If this does go to trial, are you gonna put them on the stand?
I'm not gonna tell you who we're gonna put on the stand and not put on the stand. You know the answer to that question already.
Work with me here. I ask because I don't want it to turn into a circus and a carnival. I don't ask for my sake. I want you to put them on the stand. And you can read into that anything you want to read into it. Okay, let me guess. This is how this worked. The first one, the Omaha cops talked to her. She said, oh God, Bailey's killed 7 or 8 people. Oh, he's a vampire. He's from the 15 or 1600s and they like crazy stuff. And is that the gist of the conversation? Yeah. Now put them on the stand and see what they say.
This is definitely the power play. He's pushing to find out what else they know, like who are you going to put on the stand? And they're going, we're not going to tell you. And then he moves to a different strategy, which is, you don't want the families to go through the circus of hearing all the details again. So he's saying, I'm trying to be considerate. But in fact, what he's doing in the interview itself is still throwing out emotionally provocative material without filling in any detail. So the psychopath is saying, I'm smarter than these people, I can run circles around them, so I'm going to tell you how this is going to go.
Get the feeling like we're here so you can figure out whether or not we've got any cards in our hands, and that ain't going to happen.
So why haven't y'all charged me with murder? As much information as you got. I mean, I'm just curious. I'm just curious. I don't like the stress, I don't like the headaches, I'm not a very patient person. You've got what you got. What do you need? I mean, whatever's going to be charged, I want it charged. I want it. Let's do it. Let's get it done.
Okay. So when we get what I call a confession from people, because there's a lot of people that say this is a confession, but who, the what, the when, the where, that's what we.
I thought you had all that.
You're playing cat and mouse.
No. I'm not playing with anybody. I don't play games.
Despite Trail saying he's not playing games with the detectives, it's really obvious that he is. If he really wanted this whole thing to be over, the simple solution would have been to give them a very clear and detailed answer about how he lured Sydney in, what happened the night she was murdered, who dismembered her body and disposed of it, who was a witness to it, and why they went on the run. But Aubrey Trail isn't giving them any of that information.
I said, I did it, what more do you want? But back to your questions. You found Sydney's body in bags. Yeah, you're missing 2 small ones.
What was in those 2 small ones?
The soul
Okay.
and the blood.
So if you don't mind me asking, how you put a soul in a bag?
Let's talk about that another time. It's just it's a
what?
It's a belief, I guess. It's a belief.
Okay.
I mean, one day soon you'll find that I'm not delusional. I'm not totally insane. I can't make that, like you told me, I can't make that up.
There is breaking news tonight, and it is major, in the death and disappearance of Nebraska woman Sydney Loof. First-degree murder charges have been lodged against Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. There they are right there. You recall, Loof set up an online date with Bailey Boswell, then went missing for days.
So, we're here to have a little chat with you, obviously, Aubrey. Yeah, I dreamed of it. Here's my only thing, Aubrey, is this. It's kind of a moving target with you, and I get it. I always love making the FBI chase their tails, you know? You said on a number of occasions that we'll charge you and you'll tell us. So, you've been charged with first-degree murder of Sydney Loof. Number 15. Has Bailey been murdered? Yes. Same thing?
Yes, same thing.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing we want to know is the truth. Because what you just gave us was a little.
Sydney Loof went out with Bailey 14th. They got high, smoked weed. The next day, Bailey went and picked Sydney up. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. I don't remember. Sydney came back to our house. I offered Sydney a large amount of money, $5,000 cash, which I gave her to participate in 2 of the girls' fantasies. In the process, Sydney Loof died.
I don't think we can totally believe anything he's saying. And the version that he's maintaining that there was this autoerotica scenario and he accidentally strangled Sydney Loof just doesn't add up. The detectives aren't buying this. They now know with the evidence that's continued to come out that this was a far more elaborate, calculated, and premeditated scheme, and that Sydney Loof essentially never had a chance the minute she walked into the clutches of Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell.
There was lots of violent sex involved. There was strangulation involved. It was not supposed to go as far as it did, but it did. I don't distinguish between murder and anything else. She died, I did it. What else you want to know?
He obviously gets pleasure from deceiving people. He gets pleasure from exploiting women's bodies. And he must get excitement or thrill from hurting women and humiliating them. So he's, a sexual psychopath. And part of that is enjoying hurting them and killing them.
So at 10:35 in the morning, you bought 2 packages of DeWalt hacksaw blades. Why are you buying a hacksaw? I don't know. Didn't buy anything to cut anybody up with the next step.
The problem is this, Bobby, is that these items that are being bought in the morning and the afternoon before Sid dies are used in disposing of her body. We'll do it. It's called planning. You disagree? So the trash bag Bailey Boswell lies are found out at the scene where Sidney Loof's body is. Okay. I'm looking at this saying, they're out buying all of the stuff that they're going to use to dispose of a body before the poor girl is dead. Does it not look weird, huh?
After making the date appointment, Bailey Boswell and Trail went to the store to buy the bleach, the bags, the tarp, even the sauna outfits. So this was not, as Aubrey Trail has described it, as an accident that happened during a sex film. When you look at all the details, this is a team that worked on finding young women, getting them into that circle, and they were actually planning ahead of time to kill them and dismember their body. And Bailey Boswell is not an innocent player in this. She is a female psychopath and is as callous as Aubrey Trail. It's easier to think of Aubrey Trail, a man, as the significant psychopath in this story, but I think she's an equal player because she had to go out and get the victims and she knew what she was doing and it didn't bother her.
Let's swing back to the sex fantasy. Let's do that. How'd you set it up with Sid?
Cash. I said, would you be willing to do it now? And eventually she agreed to it. The last thing that Sidney Loof ever said to me is, will I be okay? And I said, yes. And I did kill Sidney Loof. All this you're trying to prove is irrelevant. The girl's dead. And do you really want to put this family through this again? Because I don't.
One of the interesting dynamics that emerges in this version of Trail's story is that he essentially is acting as a It's the ultimate act of disregard for another human being because it is human trafficking. You are making money off the acts of somebody else. Parasitic lifestyles are something that we oftentimes see with psychopathic offenders. That pimp lifestyle is consistent with what we see with parasitic behavior.
It was somebody else's fantasy that was getting paid for.
Yes.
You got paid 15 grand to set it up.
Yeah.
And then out of that 15, Sidney gets 5.
Yes.
So you get to keep 10.
Yes.
And so then the sex acts happen in your place and she dies in the bedroom.
That's true.
Tell me what about it.
The body was cut up because our apartment, have you been there? Across the street, there's an apartment where 4 or 5 families live. There was no way I could get her out into a vehicle without 30 people seeing it.
How did you cut that body up without there being a huge mess?
Let's say we were very thirsty that day.
Okay, so you drank a bunch of blood. Then please take me through how you drank all of her blood.
No, not all. I'm just
He wants to be Charles Manson, where he can be looked up to and almost like worshipped. He's like a cult leader. He has these women he's lured into the house. He calls them his girls. Manson had an entourage of women around him that were dependent on him. So he's created his little world where these women need him. He supports them. It's entirely possible that this belief system that he's talking about is something that helped them think about him in a greater than human sort of way. Like he's a vampire, he's a warlock, he's special. But I think it's a narrative that's used to control other people rather than reflecting something he believes in, like a religious belief.
How did you carry the blood? Was it in a container? Was it in a bag?
That is going to verge too much on the freaky. So
We're pretty, we could handle it. 3 of us.
not Bailey Boswell, cup of coffee. And then the balance was put into the container and at the proper spot in a place. It was poured over that spot. The cemetery in Clay County, it's a very sacred place to us. And in our beliefs, it's very important. What you found was 6 parts. She was laid as she was because we believe in that position, and because of what's missing from her, that she will come back quicker.
Okay.
We're of the belief of reincarnation with a twist.
The whole story of this ritual feels very shallow, very glib, and disingenuous. A large part of psychopathy, and we see this very clearly here, is the intense narcissism, the grandiosity, the need for admiration. Now, if you think about this guy, Aubrey Trail, he's not good looking by most standards. He's not particularly charismatic by most standards. He is not particularly intelligent by most standards. So how do you lure vulnerable women if you're not charismatic, talented, or intelligent? And so in his narcissism, he creates a cult to enrich himself, but also to make himself feel really important so that he could be worshipped as this powerful vampire and then abuse girls and exploit them.
The cemetery's up here, and where I'd chosen for her to lay is here. And we stopped as we drove. I could put it where and lay it where I wanted it to go. The head was put here. She agreed to participate.
Okay.
Their fantasy was to bring someone to the brink, and she knew there would be violent sex involved.
Okay.
She knew there would be pain.
Okay. So, one person unknown is having sex, right?
Right.
And then you were in front of her using extension cord. What's the other person?
Watching her eyes. I'm standing, pulling.
Okay.
Here, trying to see her eyes.
Okay.
As they come in and out. I know it's a freaky thing, man.
Yeah.
90% of the girls that you meet are either on drugs, or thieves themselves, or running from the law, or have warrants, and don't have a lot of money. $5,000 is a lot of money to them, you know?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot they won't do.
Trail's not taking responsibility for how he's exploiting these women. He's actually admitting to the fact that he looks for disenfranchised, down on their luck females who have addiction issues, who have psychological instability, who are essentially vulnerable and needy. And he preys on them. And he doesn't see it that way, and like some psychopaths, he's just failing to take responsibility for any part of this. What we see is a real disregard for women. There isn't any regret or remorse for what he's done.
I love all my girls. I love every one of them. But they love my money. They love what I can do for them.
Well, but the money's not there now.
So
does that love go away?
Of course it does. Of course it does. Everything in this world is based on money.
Talking openly about how he needed to use these young women to enrich himself. It does feel honest, but he's also bragging. Look at me, I'm such a straight shooter. I'm telling you the truth. I love money because you're a hypocrite and you won't admit it. He's arguing that these relationships are transactional, but it's not, it's exploitative. Transactional, both parties know exactly what they're getting into. Most relationships with psychopaths are exploitative.
You're not going to convict Bailey Boswell for something she did not do.
Well,
Bailey wanted to be a part of something so bad, but I would not let Bailey cross that line because it's too addictive. It's like crack cocaine. The lifestyle is scary at times, but it's an adrenaline rush from hell. I knew this had the potential of going bad, and I still let it go through because I was greedy. It was way too dangerous. It was dangerous, and I knew it. We had a discussion, and the subject come up that maybe Bailey should just be gone. You know, maybe she should just disappear with everybody else.
But you disappear with everybody else.
Maybe Bailey should be killed. A girl's dead, you're dead. You participated in it. You were there. You looked at murder. We're discussing how to get rid of a dead body. And your girlfriend ain't helped at all, and she knows everything about it. Is she gonna go down for murder with us? What do we do?
We often wonder, can a psychopath fall in love, right? I think the answer to that is kind of. I think that psychopaths can become very attached to people because they are useful, that they're as useful as your favorite pair of shoes, your favorite car. It's useful. You like how it runs. It gets you there. And I think in some way, Bailey Boswell was useful to Trail. And it might have been because she generated good business, that she turned out to be really good at recruiting women online and bringing more women into his cult. If Trail has a goal of trying to have Bailey Boswell charged with a lesser crime, he's got a plan. There's a plan on his mind about what he needs her for in the future, because I don't think that she means anything more to him than any of the money.
Prosecutors called 3 females in their early 20s to testify. All talked about having sexual encounters, being controlled, and told that they were part or could be part of the 12 to 13 girls in Trail's witchcraft covenant. Trail claimed he was a vampire with special powers. The first said Trail and Boswell told them she'd have to kill to fully become a witch.
Bailey is innocent and I curse you all.
In the middle of court, Aubrey Trail, on trial for the first-degree murder of Sidney Louf, actually slashed his throat.
Trail snuck a razor into court. He sliced his neck, and was nothing other than more strategy and gameplay. While media reported that he slashed his throat, it was far less dramatic than that. He took a razor blade and sliced his neck superficially. The fact that Trail chose to do that, there's no doubt that that was a manipulative act to simply try and derail the trial.
Till now, I have never told the truth about how and why Sidney died. Once I sat Sidney down and started explaining how we made money, some of our criminal activities, and about the group sex and other things, Sidney somewhat freaked out. The truth is, I killed Sidney because of her reaction to what I had told her. I have always told the truth when I said Bailey was not in the bedroom when I killed Sidney.
I don't think it occurs to him to even pretend to be remorseful, because what he's much more motivated by, what is his driving impulse, is to hold an audience, to be admired, to be seen as successful, to be seen as dangerous.
One witness testified that, quote, Trail and Boswell talked about murder and torture often. Quote, she mainly talked about dismembering people, breaking fingernails, breaking fingers, and that when Bailey described various torture methods, she was, quote, joyful. She would smile and giggle. Her eyes would light up almost.
I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
At that point when that video is made, they know that Sydney Loof is dead. They know that they've dismembered her. They know that they've disposed of her body parts. And if Trail is to be believed, they know they drank her blood. They know they disposed of her organs. They know that they obstructed the investigative process. And the two of them are doing that together.
Bailey Boswell is not the innocent victim in this whole story. Although Aubrey Trail wants to paint her in that light, he wants to describe her as she'd been victimized by an abusive, stalking boyfriend, and he's rescued her. To be clear, she's been a part.
At 6:17 a.m., the phone rang inside a quiet house in Sydney's western suburbs, and by the time it stopped ringing, a life had already slipped out of reach, leaving behind a silence so loud it would echo for decades, a silence that would turn into headlines, into whispers, into a cold case that refused to stay buried. The street looked ordinary that morning, dew clinging to trimmed hedges, bins lined up with mechanical precision, commuters pulling out of driveways on autopilot, unaware that just one house away, time had frozen. Inside, a bedroom window stood half open. The bed was untouched. A handbag lay on the floor, tipped over. Its contents spilled like punctuation marks in a sentence no one could finish reading. There was no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, no blood, just absence. And absence, investigators would soon learn, can be the most violent thing of all. She was 26 years old, known to her friends as careful, predictable, almost boring in the best way. She caught the same train every morning, ordered the same coffee, called her mother every Sunday night. The kind of routine that builds an alibi for the future, the kind that makes disappearance feel impossible. When she didn't show up for work, her supervisor assumed a sick day. When she missed lunch plans, friends shrugged. It wasn't until night fell and the phone kept going to voicemail that the unease set in, thin at first, then tightening like a wire around the chest. By the time police arrived, neighbors were already peeking through curtains, sensing something off, sensing that this wasn't just another domestic dispute or a late-night argument gone wrong. This felt cleaner. Too clean. The initial search moved fast, then faster, then stalled. Dogs traced the scent to the curb and lost it. CCTV offered fragments, shadows, a figure passing through a frame without a face, a timestamp that raised more questions than answers. Detectives walked the street, knocked on doors, scribbled notes, circled names, all while the media began to circle too, hungry, relentless, turning a private nightmare into a public spectacle. Mystery disappearance shocked Sydney. The headline screamed, "Young woman vanishes without a trace." The word cold case hadn't appeared yet, but it was already forming slowly, like frost creeping across glass. Inside the family home, the air grew heavy. Her room stayed untouched, clothes still hanging, shoes still lying by the door. Her mother slept with the hallway light on, as if brightness could keep the unknown at bay. Her father replayed the last conversation in his head, until the words lost meaning, just sound, just noise. Every knock at the door triggered a spike of hope, followed by disappointment. Every phone call felt like a verdict. And every day that passed without answers pushed the case one step closer to a place no family ever wants to visit, the place where questions outnumber memories. Police chased leads that went nowhere. A former boyfriend with a temper, but a solid alibi. A co-worker rumored to be obsessed. Cleared after interviews. A strange car seen idling, later identified as a delivery driver. Each lead arrived with urgency, burned bright, then fizzled out, leaving behind the same hollow space. Investigators talked about probabilities, about statistics, about how most missing persons cases resolve quickly. This one didn't. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Posters faded on lampposts. The public's attention drifted. But somewhere, someone knew something. That belief became the case's oxygen, keeping it alive even as evidence evaporated. By the end of the first year, the word cold entered the conversation. Cold case. 2 syllables that sound clinical, harmless, until you live inside them. Cold meant the phones rang less. Cold meant the case file gathered dust. Cold meant birthdays passed with an empty chair and Christmas photos cropped to hide the gap. Cold meant the family learned to live with a double life, one where they smiled in public and screamed in private. Cold meant Sydney moved on, while one street stayed haunted. Rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. She had run away. She had met someone online. She was taken by someone she trusted. She stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. Each theory carried its own cruelty, offering just enough detail to hurt, but not enough to heal. Talkback radio dissected her life. Strangers debated her choices. Armchair detectives constructed timelines that collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the official investigation slowed to a crawl, punctuated by occasional bursts of activity, whenever a tip came in, whenever bones were found in bushland, whenever hope briefly flared and then died again. Years passed. Technology changed. DNA databases grew. Old evidence was re-examined under new lights. A fiber once dismissed became interesting. A partial print once unusable gained potential. Detectives who hadn't been there in 2001 picked up the file with fresh eyes, noticing inconsistencies, gaps, moments that didn't quite add up. Why had the back gate been unlocked? Why had one neighbor waited days before mentioning a late-night noise? Why did a witness change their story, just slightly, just enough to matter? The case warmed, then cooled again, like a heartbeat struggling to find rhythm. For the family, time did not heal. It sharpened. Grief matured into something harder, heavier, a constant companion. They learned the language of law enforcement, the meaning of phrases like persons of interest and ongoing investigation. They learned patience the hard way. They learned how to exist inside uncertainty, how to answer the same questions from journalists year after year without breaking. And still, every night before sleep, the same thought returned, uninvited and relentless. Someone out there knows exactly what happened. In 2016, a tip surfaced that changed the temperature of the room. It wasn't dramatic. No confession. No sudden revelation. Just a name, reintroduced, pulled from the past, and placed back under the microscope. A man who had lived nearby. A man whose routine intersected with hers in small, forgettable ways. A man who had been questioned once and released. At the time, nothing stuck. Now, with new tools and old questions, detectives looked again. They followed him quietly. They rebuilt timelines. They searched records that hadn't existed 15 years earlier. The media caught wind of movement, and the headlines returned, cautious but electric. Sydney Cole case reopened. New hope in 2001 disappearance. When the arrest finally came, it didn't arrive with sirens or spectacle. It came early, controlled, procedural. Handcuffs clicked shut. A face appeared on screens across the country. Older now, line by time, offering no explanation, no visible emotion. The family watched in their living room, hands shaking, tears flowing, relief and terror colliding in the same breath. After decades, there was a name, a body in custody, a moment the world labeled closure. But closure is a word that promises more than it delivers. Because even with an arrest, the questions didn't stop. Evidence was circumstantial. Motive remained unclear. No body had ever been found. The story, once thought finished, twisted again, revealing how fragile certainty can be. In court documents, in leaked reports, in late-night discussions, doubt crept back in. Had justice finally caught up? Or was this another chapter in a story defined by absence? The community, once shocked by a disappearance, now wrestled with something more unsettling. the possibility that the truth was still incomplete. And so the case sits in a strange, uneasy place, officially closed, emotionally wide open, a cold case by name but not by nature, still radiating heat, still burning into the collective memory of a city that thought it had moved on. Somewhere between the arrest and the unanswered questions, between relief and suspicion, the real mystery lingers, refusing to settle, reminding everyone involved that some stories don't end cleanly, they just stop making sense, leaving behind a trail of echoes and a silence that never truly fades. The silence after the arrest didn't feel like relief. It felt like pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks, because beneath the headlines and the tearful sound bites, the machinery of doubt had already started to turn. Detectives sat in windowless rooms replaying old interviews, listening not just to what had been said, but to what had been avoided, the pauses, the deflections, the moments where memory bent just enough to accommodate a lie. The man in custody had aged, but the past hadn't loosened its grip on him, and every answer he gave seemed rehearsed for a version of events that no longer existed. Outside, the city absorbed the news in uneven waves. Some people convinced justice had finally arrived, others unsettled by how long it had taken, how quietly it had crept in. Evidence, once scarce, now felt overwhelming and insufficient at the same time. Boxes were pulled from storage, sealed tape sliced open, contents laid out under fluorescent lights like artifacts from a vanished world. A diary entry, mundane on its face, suddenly carried weight. A receipt placed someone at the wrong location, at the wrong time. Phone records, once unreadable, now spoke in patterns, pings, gaps that screamed louder than calls ever could. Investigators traced movements through data that hadn't existed in 2001, reconstructing a morning minute by minute, building a fragile scaffold of probability. Still no body, no definitive scene, just inference stacked on inference, daring a jury to believe. The street where it all began had changed, but not enough. New paint on fences, different cars and driveways, the same curve in the road where the dogs lost the scent. Neighbors were interviewed again, some cooperative, some defensive, some genuinely confused by how much time had passed. Memories had softened, blurred by repetition, by years of telling the story to themselves until it felt true. One neighbor insisted they'd heard footsteps that morning. Another swore the street had been quiet. Someone mentioned a van again, white this time, or maybe it had always been white. Details shifted like sand, and detectives knew better than to trust any single grain. The media returned with sharper teeth. Panels debated the strength of the case. Experts argued about forensic thresholds. Headlines hedged their bets. Pairing arrests with questions remained, planting doubt between the lines. The phrase cold case resurfaced not as history, but as accusation, a reminder of years lost, of opportunities missed. Commentators asked how someone could disappear in a city like Sydney without leaving a trail. The answer, uncomfortable and unsatisfying, was that cities are excellent at swallowing people whole. Inside the family home, emotions collided in unpredictable ways. Hope arrived late and left early. Relief turned into anger. Anger folded back into grief. They were asked to trust a system that had taken decades to act, to believe that this time the pieces would hold. Lawyers explained procedures, timelines, the meaning of words like committal hearing and burden of proof. Each term felt heavy, abstract, incapable of capturing the simple truth that someone was missing and had been for most of their lives. Nights grew restless again, sleep fractured by dreams that offered answers and stole them away just before waking. As the case edged toward court, the narrative narrowed, focusing on the accused, his movements, his past. Old acquaintances were tracked down, some reluctant, some eager to talk after years of silence. Stories emerged, not criminal, not damning, but suggestive. A temper glimpsed at a barbecue. An argument overheard through thin walls. None of it proof, all of it texture, the kind that fills the spaces where facts refuse to sit. Prosecutors weighed what to use, what to discard, aware that too much speculation could poison the very outcome they sought. Behind closed doors, investigators argued among themselves. Some believed the case was strong enough, that time had finally aligned the pieces. Others worried about the gaps, the reliance on technology layered over memory, the absence that still defined everything. They spoke about reasonable doubt, about juries, about how absence can be weaponized by defense. They knew that once a case like this reaches trial, it stops belonging to people who lived it and starts belonging to strangers in a room, tasked with deciding truth by consensus. The accused maintained his silence, advised, controlled, his face unreadable in brief appearances that fueled endless speculation. Body language experts dissected his posture. Psychologists theorized motives. Online forums exploded with certainty, users building elaborate timelines, accusing, defending, rewriting the case with the confidence of distance. The story took on a second life, digital and relentless, untethered from evidence, feeding on emotion. For every voice calling for patience, another demanded answers now, closure now, as if volume could summon truth. Then came the first procedural setback, a motion challenge, a piece of evidence deemed inadmissible. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to shift the mood. Suddenly, the certainty frayed. Reporters recalibrated their language. Supporters of the family braced themselves. The cold case, briefly warmed by momentum, seemed to exhale, releasing a chill that reminded everyone how fragile this moment was. One ruling, one misstep, and decades of waiting could collapse into nothing. Investigators returned to the field, retracing steps they knew by heart, hoping for something overlooked, something small and stupid and decisive, a discarded object, a witness who had never been found, a detail hiding in plain sight. They walked bushland again, scanning ground that had been searched before, aware that time changes landscapes as thoroughly as it changes people. Every rustle, every fragment, carried potential until it didn't. The absence pressed in, familiar and suffocating. Through it all, the city watched, half engaged, half exhausted by the weight of unresolved stories. Other crimes competed for attention. New tragedies arrived. But this one lingered, a ghost refusing to be replaced. It had become shorthand for something larger, a symbol of what happens when time outpaces truth. Conversations returned to it whenever another case stalled, another family waited. Remember Sydney, 2001, people would say, as warning or comfort, depending on their mood. As court dates loomed and shifted, the family learned to live again in limbo, suspended between vindication and collapse. They prepared statements they might never read. They braced for outcomes they couldn't control. In quiet moments, when the noise receded, the original question returned, unchanged by arrests or headlines or hope. What really happened that morning, in that house, on that street? The system could label the case closed, the files could be stamped and shelved, but truth, if it existed at all, still hovered just out of reach, waiting, watching, refusing to settle, reminding everyone that some cold cases don't end. They simply move into a new phase of uncertainty, where every answer creates another shadow, and every shadow looks like it might be the truth. Time has a way of rearranging priorities, and by the time the case reached its third decade, the urgency felt different, heavier, less about speed and more about endurance, about who could last longer, the truth or the doubt. Courtrooms became the new landscape, cold and polished, every surface designed to look neutral, while quietly amplifying tension. The first hearing drew a crowd that didn't quite know why it was there, journalists chasing continuity, members of the public searching for resolution, the family sitting together, shoulders almost touching, as if proximity alone could keep them upright. When the accused entered, escorted, eyes forward, the room tightened, breath collectively held, waiting for something dramatic to happen, something cinematic. Nothing did, and that somehow felt worse. The prosecution spoke in careful language, laying out a timeline that looked solid from a distance and fragile up close. Morning routines, overlapping paths, a window of opportunity measured in minutes. They spoke of patterns, of proximity, a behavior that deviated just enough to matter. Each point landed with a dull thud, not explosive, but cumulative, like water filling a room slowly. The defense listened without interruption, making notes, nodding occasionally, already planning how to drain that room dry. Reasonable doubt wasn't a concept to them. It was a strategy. Outside, microphones waited. Reporters asked the same questions with different words. Is this enough? Does the family feel confident? What happens if it falls apart? The answers blurred together, cautious, guarded, heavy with the knowledge that anything said could be replayed, dissected, weaponized. The phrase cold case hovered in every conversation, a reminder that time was both the prosecution's ally and its enemy. It explained the gaps, but it also created them. As testimony unfolded, the past was dragged into the present piece by piece. Old statements were read aloud, their language stiff, dated, frozen in 2001. Witnesses took the stand, older now, voices less certain, eyes flicking between lawyers as if searching for cues. Some stuck to their original accounts with stubborn loyalty. Others drifted, corrected themselves, admitted they weren't sure anymore. Memory, it turned out, was not a recording but a reconstruction, and every retelling had quietly altered it. The defense leaned into that instability, pressing gently, then harder, until confidence cracked and hesitation spilled out. One witness, once considered minor, suddenly carried weight. A late-night noise, a movement seen from a window. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest possibility. The prosecution elevated it. The defense dismantled it. Distance, lighting, assumptions. Could have been someone else? Could have been nothing at all? By the time the witness stepped down, the room felt unsettled, unsure what it had just seen, aware only that certainty had slipped further away. Forensic experts followed, speaking in precise terms, probabilities stacked with decimals, language designed to sound authoritative while admitting its own limitations, fibers that matched a category, not a source, traces that suggested contact, not causation. The jury listened, faces carefully blank, absorbing information that required translation even as it was delivered. The absence of a body loomed over every explanation, an unspoken question no one could answer directly. Where is she? Every theory bent around that void. The family watched it all with a discipline forged by years of waiting. They had learned when to lean forward, when to look down, when to brace. Some days brought a flicker of hope, a phrase that sounded promising, a connection that felt real. Other days hollowed them out, reminding them how easily they could end without resolution. They had prepared for this, told themselves they were ready for any outcome, but readiness dissolved quickly under the weight of each new doubt. Meanwhile, the city argued. Talkback radio lit up. Opinion columns sharpened. Some declared the case airtight, long overdue justice finally catching up. Others warned or rushed to closure, of the danger in trying to force an ending onto a story that resisted it for decades. The accused became a symbol, either of hidden evil finally exposed or of a system desperate to save face. Nuance didn't survive long in that environment. Certainty, even false certainty, was easier to sell. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Prosecutors knew the stakes extended beyond this one trial. A conviction would validate years of renewed investigation. An acquittal would raise uncomfortable questions about why now, why this man, why this evidence. Defense lawyers sensed that pressure and exploited it, painting a picture of institutional desperation, of a case warmed not by new truth but by public expectation. They spoke about timelines collapsing under scrutiny, about coincidences masquerading as connections, about how easy it is to see patterns once you decided where you want them to lead. Midway through proceedings, a moment landed harder than expected. A previously unknown detail surfaced, not explosive but awkward, something overlooked rather than hidden. A report filed late, a note that hadn't been followed up. The courtroom shifted, not toward outrage, but toward discomfort. It wasn't proof of innocence or guilt, just proof of imperfection. And in a case built on delayed certainty, imperfection was dangerous. The prosecution adjusted. The defense smiled thinly, and the family felt the floor tilt just enough to notice. Nights grew longer again. Analysts replayed footage, slowing it down, filling silence with speculation. Online, theories mutated faster than facts could keep up. Some claimed insider knowledge. Others alleged cover-ups. The original mystery, once about a disappearance, now included the investigation itself, its choices, its blind spots. Trust became another casualty, eroded not by malice but by time and repetition. As closing arguments approached, tension compressed. Every day felt borrowed. The prosecution appealed to patience, to the idea that truth doesn't always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it must be inferred from the shape of what's missing. The defense appealed to caution, to the irreversible nature of judgment, to the risk of mistaking probability for proof. Both spoke with conviction. Both sounded reasonable. And that, more than anything, terrified the people who had waited so long for clarity. The judge reminded the jury of their duty, of the standard they must meet, beyond reasonable doubt. Words that sound simple until you try to apply them to a life, to a disappearance, to decades of unanswered questions. The jury retired, the room emptied, and the waiting resumed familiar and cruel. Outside, cameras stayed trained on the doors, ready to capture reactions that might explain what words could not. In that suspended moment, before a verdict could solidify anything, the case existed in its purest form, not solved, not failed, but hovering, defined entirely by uncertainty. The arrest had promised an ending. The trial had complicated it. And now, as the system paused to decide what truth it could live with, the original absence pressed back into focus, reminding everyone that no matter what came next, some part of the story would remain unresolved, a cold case not because it lacked attention, but because it resisted warmth, resisted closure, and refused to give back what had taken all those years ago. The verdict didn't arrive with the clarity people expected. It arrived like fog, soft-edged and disorienting, rolling in slowly until no one could quite see where they were standing anymore. Guilty on one count, not guilty on another. A technical dismissal that sounded procedural but landed like a gut punch. In the courtroom, no one moved at first. The family stared ahead, trying to translate legal language into something that resembled meaning. The accused exhaled, not in relief, not in despair, just an acknowledgement, as if he'd been expecting ambiguity all along. Outside, the cameras caught fragments, tears, clenched jaws, hands shaking, and stitched them into a narrative that pretended to be an ending. But nothing ended. Appeals were filed almost immediately. The defense challenged evidentiary rulings. The prosecution defended its approach. Legal experts flooded the airwaves, explaining what this verdict did and did not mean, emphasizing nuance while knowing nuance rarely survives consumption. Cold case partially resolved. One headline read, hedging its bets. Another went further. Justice delayed, justice denied. The story fractured, splitting into interpretations that no longer spoke to each other. The family returned home to a house that had learned how to wait. Flowers arrived, some congratulatory, some condolent, some simply confused about what they were supposed to mark. Friends called, unsure whether to say congratulations or apologies. There was no script for this moment, no etiquette for a resolution that didn't resolve. In private, the questions resumed their old places, lining up at night, relentless and unchanged. Was this the truth? Was this enough? Or had the system simply chosen the least uncomfortable version of events? For investigators, the verdict reopened wounds they had tried to close. Some felt vindicated. Others felt exposed. The case review meetings grew tense, voices sharp, patience thin. They revisited decisions made years earlier, wondering which ones had mattered, which ones had doomed them from the start. Hindsight rearranged everything, turning reasonable choices into potential failures. The absence of a body still dominated every conversation, an accusation without words, a reminder that certainty had never been fully on the table. The accused, now convicted but not conclusively condemned, retreated into a strange half-life, not fully free, not fully punished. His name remained tied to the case, searchable, permanent. Supporters argued he'd been targeted, scapegoated by a system desperate for closure. Detractors insisted the verdict was lenient, that something darker had slipped through the cracks. He said little. Silence, once again, proved to be the most durable strategy. Meanwhile, new tips began to surface, as they always do when a case returns to the spotlight. Some were earnest, some were delusional, some were opportunistic. Detectives followed up anyway, compelled by habit, by hope, by the fear of missing the one detail that might finally make sense of everything. A remote property mentioned in passing, a former acquaintance who had moved overseas, a rumor that had circulated for years but never reached the right desk. Each lead carried promise until it didn't, collapsing under scrutiny, leaving behind the same familiar emptiness. The community, restless and unsatisfied, kept talking. Documentaries were commissioned. Podcasts dissected timelines down to the minute, layering sound design over speculation, turning uncertainty into entertainment. The victim's name became a brand, shorthand for unresolved loss. With every retelling, the story sharpened and blurred at the same time, details polished for impact, complexity sanded down. The real person at the center of it all grew harder to see. In quiet moments, the family resisted that transformation. They spoke about who she had been before the headlines, before the case file, before the phrase, Sydney 2001 cold case, replace her name in public memory. They remembered small things, bad jokes, favorite songs, the way she folded laundry. These memories felt fragile now, threatened not by time but by noise, by the constant retelling of a version of her life that ended too soon and began to overshadow everything else. Legally, the case moved into a prolonged afterlife. Appeals crawled through the system. Judges weighed technical arguments disconnected from the rawness of loss. Years passed again, slower this time, marked by paperwork instead of searches. The possibility of a retrial hovered, then receded. The conviction stood, then wavered, then stood again. Each update reignited attention briefly before it faded, leaving behind fatigue instead of hope. And still no body. Bushland continued to grow and change, swallowing paths, erasing markers. Construction reshaped parts of the city, paving over spaces once considered relevant. Time, relentless and indifferent, collaborated with geography to erase opportunities. Every season that passed reduced the chances of discovery, even as technology promised miracles. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced DNA recovery, tools that sounded like answers but required something to find. Privately, some investigators admitted what they would never say on record, that the case might be as solved as it would ever be, not because the truth had been fully uncovered, but because the system had reached its limit. Law can declare conclusions where reality refuses to cooperate. Closure, in that sense, became an administrative act, not an emotional one. Files could be closed. Lives could not. The family grappled with that distinction daily. They learned to exist alongside a verdict they didn't fully trust and a mystery they couldn't abandon. Publicly, they thanked those who had worked on the case. Privately, they revisited old photos, old messages, looking for signs they might have missed, moments that might now read differently. Grief evolved again, reshaping itself around a truth that felt incomplete but unavoidable. As the years stacked up, the case settled into collective memory in an uneasy way. Not a warning, not a victory, but a question mark. It surfaced whenever someone spoke about cold cases, about the promise and the danger of reopening old wounds. It became an example, cited in training seminars and opinion pieces, a story used to argue opposing points depending on who was telling it. Justice had been served, some said. Justice had been approximated, others countered. No one could say it had been fully achieved. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath verdicts and appeals and arguments, the original silence persisted, unchanged since that morning in 2001. A room left empty, a life interrupted, a city that kept moving while one family stayed suspended in the space between answers and acceptance. The case was closed on paper, but in reality it continued to breathe, to haunt, to resist the finality everyone wanted from it, reminding those who listen closely that some cold cases don't fade away. They simply learn how to survive in plain sight, unresolved, unsettling, and permanently incomplete. By the time the appeals were exhausted and the legal language settled into permanence, the story had already begun to drift, not toward peace, but toward something quieter and more dangerous: normalization. The case stopped being breaking news and started being background noise, a reference point pulled out when convenient, then pushed back into storage. For the family, this was the hardest phase. Not the chaos of investigation, not the spectacle of trial, but the long, flat stretch afterward, where the world seemed to accept an answer they were still struggling to understand. They noticed it in small ways. fewer calls from journalists, emails that went unanswered, invitations that stopped arriving. People assumed they were doing better now, as if a verdict functioned like medicine, as if time plus procedure equaled healing. But healing had never been the goal. Truth was, and truth still felt just out of frame, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refused to surface no matter how hard you search for it. Inside police circles, the case took on a different life. It became a study. Recruits were walked through it step by step, shown how patients could resurrect a cold case, how technology could reopen doors time had sealed shut. But it was also used as a cautionary tale, a reminder that reopening the past carries risk, that momentum can be mistaken for certainty, that once a narrative locks in, it becomes harder to question. In quiet moments, among trusted colleagues, doubts were voiced, then shelved, then revisited again, cycling endlessly without resolution. One detective, now retired, kept a copy of the case file at home. Not officially, not acknowledged, just a habit he couldn't break. Some nights, he spread the papers across his dining table, rereading interviews he'd memorized years ago, hoping that age and distance might reveal something youth and urgency had missed. He circled the same lines, underlined the same phrases. The questions never changed. Why that morning? Why no trace? Why had one detail always felt slightly off, like a door not fully closed? Public fascination reignited unexpectedly when a former associate of the accused spoke out, years too late to matter legally, but early enough to inflame speculation. The statement was vague, careful, hedged with disclaimers. Not an admission, not an accusation. Just a suggestion that there had been more going on behind the scenes than anyone had known. Media outlets seized it instantly. Headlines blurred possibility into implication. New doubt in Sidney cold case. Did we get it wrong? The wound, barely scarred over, split open again. Online, theories mutated faster than ever. Some accused a new witness of attention-seeking. Others treated the statement like gospel. Old timelines were rebuilt, corrected, torn apart. By the time the story entered its third decade of retelling, fatigue had settled in like dust, thin but everywhere, coating every conversation, every article, every late-night debate that still insisted on reopening the wound. The conviction remained on record, the appeals exhausted, the legal avenues narrowing into something final on paper, but outside the courtroom the case continued to pulse, irregular and unresolved, refusing to behave like something finished. Detectives retired. Journalists moved on. New crimes demanded attention. Yet this one lingered, dragged forward by the simple fact that nothing tangible had ever been recovered, no remains, no definitive scene, no single moment that could be pointed to and declared the end. Quietly, without announcement, the investigation shifted again. Not officially reopened, not formally active, just nudged back into motion by a small unit tasked with reviewing long-term missing persons cases, the kind that never quite go away. They worked without press, without promises, sifting the material that had been handled too many times already, hoping repetition might reveal what novelty never had. Old maps were digitized. Search areas were overlaid with new satellite imagery. Construction records were cross-checked against tips that had once seemed too vague to pursue. The city, it turned out, had been rewriting itself continuously since 2001, and every change represented both a loss and a possibility. One location kept resurfacing, not because of evidence, but because of persistence. A patch of land on the outskirts, mentioned in early interviews, dismissed as unlikely, then quietly ignored as years passed. Back then it had been scrubland, accessible, unremarkable. Now it sat behind fencing and warning signs, partially redeveloped, partially abandoned, a scar of interrupted plans. On paper it had been searched. In reality, it had been glanced at and moved past. The team debated whether it was worth reopening, knowing what failure would look like, knowing what success would demand. Eventually, they went anyway. The search was methodical, almost ritualistic, each step measured against the weight of expectation. Technology did most of the talking now. Sensors scanned below the surface. Data translated soil disturbances into abstract images that required interpretation rather than instinct. There were moments of anticipation, Small spikes of interest, anomalies that pulled everyone closer, then dissolved under scrutiny. Still, they kept going, driven less by hope than by the fear of leaving something undone. In cold cases, diligence often outlives optimism. Word leaked, as it always does. A blurry photo appeared online. A single line in a local paper hinted at renewed activity. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some accused authorities of prolonging pain for attention. Others clung to the possibility that this time might be different. The family heard about it secondhand, bracing themselves for another cycle of expectation and disappointment. They had learned how to temper hope, how to let it exist without letting it take over. But even controlled hope has a way of slipping its leash. When the search concluded, it did so without ceremony. No announcement, no confirmation, just a quiet withdrawal. Equipment packed away, fencing restored. Officially, nothing had been found. Unofficially, the team carried away a new layer of frustration, the familiar sense of coming close without arriving. The absence deepened, reinforced by yet another negative result. The land returned to silence, holding whatever secrets it had always held. In the aftermath, attention drifted again, but something subtle had changed. The renewed search had reminded people how little was actually known, how much of the story had been constructed around assumptions hardened by time. Analysts revisited the original timeline with fresh skepticism. Was the window of disappearance truly as narrow as it had been presented? Had one assumption cascaded into others, narrowing the focus prematurely? These questions didn't accuse, but they destabilized, shaking the foundation just enough to keep uncertainty alive. The convicted man remained a presence in the background, his fate legally settled but socially unresolved. In rare statements issued through representatives, he continued to deny responsibility for what the public now associated irrevocably with his name. To some, the denial sounded predictable. To others, they sounded stubbornly consistent. Without new evidence, the debate circled endlessly, fueled by instinct more than proof. Guilt and innocence became positions rather than conclusions, defended with equal intensity and equal lack of finality. For the family, time compressed and stretched in strange ways. Anniversaries blurred together. Milestones arrived without context. They marked years not by dates but by absences, by how long it had been since the last real update, the last credible lead. In conversations, they avoided the word closure entirely. It had lost meaning, hollowed out by repetition. What they wanted now was something simpler and more impossible, certainty in any direction. As documentaries continued to revisit the case, each iteration claimed new angles, unseen details, exclusive insights. In reality, they rearranged the same fragments, adding mood and music where substance ran thin. The public consumed them anyway, hungry for narrative, for resolution, for the comfort of an ending. But this story resisted structure. It refused to conform. Every attempt to wrap it neatly only emphasized the shape of what was missing. Within law enforcement circles, the case became cautionary. Training sessions referenced it obliquely, as an example of how time complicates truth, how early decisions ripple outward, how absence can mislead as easily as evidence can. Younger officers listened, imagining they would do things differently, unaware that every case begins with the same optimism, the same belief that this one will not slip away. Veterans listened with quiet recognition. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath renewed searches and recycled debates and legal finality, the original moment remained untouched, suspended in memory like an unfinished sentence. A morning interrupted, a routine broken, a life that stepped out of frame and never returned. The case had accumulated layers, interpretations, outcomes, but that moment stayed raw, inaccessible, immune to analysis. By now, the term cold case no longer described temperature or attention. It described endurance, a story that refused to be forgotten not because it was sensational, but because it was incomplete. It survived through gaps, through doubts, through the uneasy realization that even after decades, even after arrests and verdicts and renewed searches, the truth might still be out there, unclaimed, unspoken, waiting in a place no one thought to look, or worse, a place already passed by, dismissed, and left behind in the long, relentless shadow of a case that would not let go. By the 7th chapter of his life, the case had stopped feeling like an investigation and started feeling like an atmosphere, something you breathe in without noticing, something that altered behavior in subtle ways. People lowered their voices when it came up. They paused before giving opinions. Even those who claimed to be tired of hearing about it still knew the details by heart. The disappearance had embedded itself into the city's subconscious, a reference point for uncertainty, for the idea that not everything broken can be fixed by time or effort. Inside police archives, the file remained accessible, flagged never fully dormant. Every few years it resurfaced during audits, its thickness both impressive and damning. Thousands of pages, dozens of leads, years of work, all circling the same void. Younger analysts tasked with reviewing it noticed something their predecessors hadn't articulated clearly enough. How often the case pivoted on assumptions treated as facts. A door believed to be unlocked. A time window accepted without challenge. A witness statement elevated because it fit, not because it was proven. None of these were mistakes on their own. Together, they formed a narrative that became increasingly difficult to question. One analyst pushed back quietly, not with accusations but with hypotheticals. What if the disappearance hadn't happened when everyone thought it did? What if the routine that defined her life had broken earlier, unnoticed? What if the house wasn't the starting point, but the midpoint? These questions didn't rewrite the case, but they loosened it, creating space for alternatives that had been dismissed too early. The problem wasn't lack of imagination. It was too much confidence in the first version of events. These doubts didn't make headlines. They circulated internally, discussed in low voices, shared between people who understood how dangerous it could be to reopen settled ground. Institutional memory is powerful, and challenging it requires more than curiosity. It requires endurance. The analysts persisted, mapping alternative timelines, testing them against what little was known. Most collapsed quickly. One didn't. It wasn't better. It was just different enough to be unsettling. According to this version, the disappearance wasn't sudden. It was incremental, a series of small decisions and coincidences that converged, unnoticed, until absence became visible. If true, it reframed everything. The witness statements didn't contradict each other. They described different moments. The lack of disturbance wasn't suspicious. It was expected. The scent trail didn't vanish. It was never there in the way people assumed. This theory didn't point cleanly to a suspect. It pointed complexity, the kind that resists prosecution but demands acknowledgement. The idea stall where all ideas stall in cold cases. Proof. Without something tangible, something that could be tested, the theory remained academic, interesting, but inert. Still, it changed how some people looked at the case. It reminded them that certainty had always been an illusion, constructed out of necessity rather than truth. And once that illusion cracked, it was impossible to unsee. The family, unaware of internal debates, continued navigating a public identity shaped by loss. They were invited to speak at events, consulted on policy discussions, positioned as representatives of unresolved grief. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes they declined. Each appearance required reopening wounds for an audience that could walk away afterward. They did it anyway, not for answers, but for presence, for the refusal to let her name become a footnote. Privately, they wrestled with a quieter fear, that the truth, if it ever emerged, might be unbearable in its ordinariness. Not a grand conspiracy, not a dramatic reveal, just a sequence of moments that spiraled quietly out of control. This fear sat alongside hope, neither canceling the other out, both exhausting in their own way. The convicted man's name faded slightly from headlines, replaced by broader questions about process, about cold cases as a concept. Conferences debated whether reopening old investigations did more harm than good. Advocates argued that time plus technology equals justice. Skeptics pointed to cases like this one, where time complicated more than it clarified. The debate never resolved, feeding off examples without learning from them. Occasionally, someone claimed to have new information, a letter, a memory triggered by a documentary, a dream mistaken for a recollection. Each was logged, assessed, and set aside. The machinery of response remained intact, even as belief in outcomes diminished. In some ways, that persistence was the most remarkable part. The refusal to stop, even when stopping would be easier. The city itself continued to change, indifferent to the weight it carried. New developments rose where empty lots had been. Roads widened. Train lines expanded. Places once central to the investigation disappeared entirely, absorbed into infrastructure. Progress erased context, making it harder to imagine the past as it had been. Maps from 2001 looked foreign now, their landmarks either gone or renamed, their relevance fading with every passing year. And yet, the morning of the disappearance remained fixed in collective memory, preserved through repetition. People remembered where they had been when they heard the news, even if they hadn't known her. They remembered the feeling more than the facts, the sense that something had broken quietly, without spectacle. That feeling endured, resurfacing whenever another person vanished, whenever another case stalled. By now, the term closure had been replaced with something less comforting and more honest, accommodation. The idea that some questions don't get answered, but must still be lived with. The family accommodated. The investigators accommodated. The city accommodated. Life adjusted around the absence, building routines that avoided it without erasing it. Still, late at night, in moments when the noise receded, the questions returned, unchanged by years or verdicts or theories. Where did she go? Who saw her last? What moment mattered most? The one everyone focused on or the one no one noticed? The case offered no reply. It simply lingered, a presence without form, reminding anyone who paid attention that uncertainty doesn't fade with time. It just learns how to wait, patient and unresolved, in the long shadow of a story that refuses to end. The 8th year after the verdict, not the disappearance, carried a different kind of weight, the kind that settles in after all the obvious questions have been asked and only the uncomfortable ones remain. The case no longer surged in waves of attention. It pulsed quietly, resurfacing in unexpected places, in academic papers, in policy meetings, in the margins of other investigations where someone would pause and say, "Remember Sydney, 2001. It had become less a story and more a reference, a cautionary outline traced around the limits of certainty. A review panel convened without fanfare, assembled not to reopen the case, but to study it, to understand how it had moved through time, how decisions made under pressure had calcified into conclusions. They weren't searching for a culprit. They were searching for patterns. What they found was not negligence, not corruption, but momentum. Early assumptions carried forward because they worked, because they offered structure in chaos. Each subsequent decision leaned on the last, until questioning the foundation felt like threatening the entire build. It was a human failure, not a procedural one, and that made it harder to correct. One member of the panel fixated on the missing hours, the stretches of time that were technically accounted for but emotionally empty. Schedules filled in with routine rather than evidence. It was assumed she followed her habits because she always had. That assumption had narrowed the search, focused attention where it felt logical, not necessarily where it was true. The panel couldn't undo that, but they could name it, and naming it mattered more than it seemed. These findings stayed mostly internal, filtered through cautious language and footnotes. Publicly, the case remained unchanged, closed, conviction recorded, no further action planned. Privately, it became a teaching tool, stripped of names and locations, its lessons abstracted to avoid reopening wounds. But the people who knew the story recognized it instantly, the shape of it unmistakable even in anonymized form. The family was informed gently that a review had taken place. No new conclusions, no new evidence, just insights. They thanked the officials out of habit, then sat with the quiet frustration of it. Insight did not bring her back. Insight did not explain where she was. Insight felt like an apology written in a language they no longer spoke. Still, they held on to one line from the briefing, a small thing, almost offhand. There are still questions worth asking. Those questions surfaced in unexpected ways. A former colleague reached out after years of silence, prompted by a rerun of a documentary. The memory wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even clear. Just a sense of something slightly off, a conversation cut short, a plan that never materialized. It didn't contradict the official timeline. It existed beside it like a parallel line. Investigators noted it, filed it, and once again found themselves balancing between skepticism and obligation. At the same time, advances in data analysis made old information newly interesting. Transit records, once considered too fragmented, were reprocessed. Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before, not definitive, but suggestive. A route used more often than expected. A delay that repeated on different days. None of it proved anything. All of it unsettled the neatness of the original narrative. The case resisted being boxed, insisting on complexity even after decades of simplification. The public barely noticed these shifts. Attention had moved on to fresher mysteries, cases with cleaner arcs and clearer villains. This one required patience, context, and acceptance of ambiguity that didn't translate well to headlines. When it did resurface, it was usually framed as history, a reminder of how far investigative techniques had come, even if they hadn't brought everyone home. For the family, time had compressed into a strange loop. They lived in the present, planned for the future, and carried the past as a constant undercurrent. They no longer expected answers, but they remained alert to them, a readiness that never fully relaxed. Every unknown number on their phone still caused a pause. Every mention of the case still tightened something in the chest. Absence had become familiar, but it never became comfortable. The city, too, had learned to live with the story in a quieter way. It no longer shocked. It haunted. It surfaced in conversations about safety, about trust, about how well you can ever know the routines that define your life. Parents reference it when talking to teenagers. Friends mention it half-jokingly when someone was late. The case had seeped into everyday language, a ghost woven into the ordinary. Late one night, an investigator reviewing the file noticed something small, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. A note scribbled in the margin of an early report, never followed up because it didn't fit anywhere. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't even a lead. It was a question. Why would she have been there at all? The investigator stared at it longer than necessary, aware that the most dangerous questions are often the simplest, the ones that challenge the story at its core. Nothing came of it immediately. There was no breakthrough, no announcement, just a quiet acknowledgement that even now, even after everything, the case still had the capacity to surprise, to unsettle, to resist finality. It reminded those still paying attention that resolution is not a single event, but a process, one that can stall, reverse, or fracture without warning. As the years continued to pass, the case occupied a strange middle ground, neither active nor dormant, neither solved nor entirely open. It existed as a living archive, a collection of moments, decisions, and silences that together formed something too complex to summarize. And in that complexity, in that refusal to be neatly concluded, the true legacy of the Sydney 2001 cold case endured, not as a lesson neatly learned, but as an ongoing question, one that lingered in the background of every discussion about truth, justice, and the long, uneasy relationship between them. By the ninth movement of the story, the case had reached a point where discovery no longer looked like revelation. It looked like erosion, slow and subtle, the wearing down of assumptions that had once seemed immovable. What remained was not clarity, but exposure, the quiet uncovering of how much had been built on what felt reasonable rather than what was provable. The cold case had become less about what happened and more about how belief had filled the gaps where truth refused to stand still. A quiet shift occurred inside the unit still assigned to monitor unresolved disappearances. No announcements, no memos circulated widely, just a recalibration of language. They stopped saying timeline and started saying range. They stopped saying last seen and started saying last confirmed. These were small changes, almost semantic, but they mattered. They acknowledged uncertainty not as failure, but as fact. In doing so, they reopened space that had been sealed for years. One particular assumption finally lost its hold, the idea that the disappearance was isolated. For decades, it had been treated as a singular event, tragic but contained. Now, analysts noticed patterns that didn't align neatly with that framing. Other missing persons, Other near misses. Reports dismissed because they lacked violence, lacked drama, lacked bodies. None of them matched cleanly. All of them resonated faintly. The question wasn't whether they were connected. The question was whether isolation itself had been an illusion. This line of thinking didn't point to a suspect. It pointed to context, to environments where routine creates vulnerability, to moments that don't register as danger until after they pass. The case began to feel less like a confrontation and more like a blind spot, something everyone looked past because it didn't announce itself loudly enough. That realization was unsettling in a different way. It suggested that even now, the truth might be ordinary, unremarkable, hiding in the shape of daily life. The family sensed a shift without being told. Conversations with officials sounded different, less definitive, more careful. Promises were replaced with acknowledgments. They were no longer being guided toward closure, but toward coexistence with uncertainty. It was not comfort, but it was honesty, and honesty carried its own quiet relief. For the first time in years, they felt less like participants in performance and more like witnesses to a process that admitted its limits. Public interest flickered again when fragments of this reframing leaked into discussion. Commentators debated whether reopening questions after a conviction undermined justice or strengthened it. Some accused authorities of rewriting history to excuse earlier mistakes. Others welcomed the humility. The case, once again, became a mirror for larger anxieties about systems, about trust, about whether certainty is ever real or just convenient. In the background, technology continued its relentless advance. Tools now existed that would have been unthinkable in 2001, or even at the time of the trial. But tools require targets, and this case still lacked the most basic one. No remains, no confirmed site, just possibilities scattered across years and miles. The promise of technology hung in the air like a dare. If you find something, we can tell you what it is. The problem was still the same. There was nothing to find. One afternoon, an old tip was re-examined not because it was strong, but because it had never been fully understood. A report of someone who looked like her, in a place that didn't fit the accepted narrative, at a time that complicated everything. Back then, it had been dismissed as mistaken identity. Now, it was reconsidered as something else, an anomaly, not proof, not contradiction, just a deviation. Deviations, the analysts knew, are where systems reveal their weaknesses. The location had changed dramatically since the report was filed. What had once been transient space was now fixed, regulated, monitored. Records existed. Cameras had been installed years after the fact, but logs remained. Investigators traced ownership, access, movement. It was painstaking and slow, offering no immediate payoff. Still, it represented something rare in this case, forward motion that didn't depend on belief. Nothing definitive emerged, but something shifted again, subtly. The possibility that the accepted endpoint of the story was wrong loosened its grip. The disappearance might not have concluded where everyone thought it had. That didn't exonerate anyone. It didn't condemn anyone either. It simply reopened the map. For the city, this new phase barely registered. Life continued, dense and loud and indifferent. The case no longer disrupted routines. It lived alongside them. People passed locations once deemed significant without knowing it. They built lives over ground layered with unanswered questions. In that sense, the case had already done its work, embedding uncertainty into the fabric of the ordinary. Late one evening, a retired investigator revisited the file on his own, driven not by duty but by restlessness. He noticed how often the case file used the word assumed. Assumed entry, assumed time, assumed sequence. At the time, those assumptions had been necessary. Now, they felt like scaffolding left in place long after the building had failed inspection. He closed the file with a familiar feeling, not regret, but something closer to humility. By now, the case had shed any illusion of a clean ending. It no longer promised revelation. It offered only proximity, the sense that understanding might be approached, never reached. The cold case endured not because it lacked attention, but because it resisted resolution at every turn. reshaping itself just enough to stay alive, just enough to remind anyone still listening that some truths do not arrive fully formed, and some stories do not conclude, they simply continue, quieter but no less unresolved, moving forward in the long shadow of everything that was never found. By the 10th stretch of its existence, the case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be understood. That distinction mattered more than anyone had expected. Solving implied an endpoint, a line crossed, a verdict that locked the past into place. Understanding implied motion, revision, the willingness to accept that the past might still be changing shape depending on how it was viewed. For those still close to it, that shift felt both liberating and terrifying. A small but significant development arrived without warning, buried in bureaucracy rather than drama. A data migration project, unrelated on the surface, brought old transport records into a unified system. Information once siloed, incomplete, almost useless on its own, now sat alongside newer datasets, finally speaking the same language. Analysts noticed inconsistencies that hadn't been visible before, not contradictions, gaps, missing confirmations where there should have been overlap. A journey assumed but never logged, a presence implied but not recorded. It didn't prove she had been there. It proved something weaker and more dangerous, that certainty had been overstated. The accepted narrative depended on continuity, on the idea that routine filled in what evidence could not. Now, routine fractured. The timeline stretched, softened, lost its edges. The disappearance was no longer anchored to a single morning or a single place. It became a range, a window wide enough to swallow alternatives that had once been impossible to consider. The implications were immediate and uncomfortable. If the timeline wasn't fixed, then the framework used to interpret everything else wobbled. Opportunity, motive, proximity, all of it had been calculated against a structure that might never have existed. This didn't overturn the conviction. It didn't absolve or accuse. It complicated. And complication, in a case like this, was both progress and threat. Internally, discussions grew cautious again. No one wanted to promise anything. No one wanted to reopen wounds without reason. But the questions were no longer hypothetical. They were grounded in data, however incomplete. The system faced a familiar dilemma, whether pursue uncertainty in the name of truth or protect finality in the name of stability. Both choices carried consequences. The family was informed in careful language, the kind designed to soften impact while conveying seriousness. There may be aspects of the timeline that need reassessment. There is no immediate change to the case status. We will keep you informed. They listened, nodded, thanked the messenger. Afterward, they sat in silence, absorbing the strange sensation of possibility returning, not as hope, but as disturbance. After years of being told the story was settled, the ground was moving again. For them, this was not reopening. It was recognition. Recognition that the story they had been asked to accept might never have fully matched reality. That recognition didn't heal anything, but it validated a feeling they had carried quietly for years, that something about the official version had always felt slightly out of alignment, like a picture hung crooked but never adjusted. Publicly, nothing changed. No press conferences. No headlines. The case remained closed in the ways that mattered to institutions. But within professional circles, the Sydney 2001 cold case regained relevance, cited now not as a success or failure, but as a reminder how easily narratives solidify around absence, how quickly the need for answers can outpace the availability of truth. A few journalists caught wind of movement, but editors hesitated. There was no hook, no clear revelation. Ambiguity didn't sell the way arrests once had. The story was allowed to stay quiet, living in the margins where it had always belonged. In that quiet, it changed again, subtly, reshaping itself without spectacle. Late one evening, a senior analyst revisited a question that had surfaced years earlier and been dismissed as unproductive. If the disappearance didn't begin where everyone thought it did, where did it begin? Not geographically. Conceptually, what moment marked the shift from ordinary to irreversible? Was it a decision made in seconds? A plan altered without telling anyone? An encounter that felt insignificant until it wasn't? There were no answers, only realizations. That the case had been treated as an interruption when it might have been a continuation. That the absence might not have been abrupt, but cumulative. That by the time anyone noticed, the story had already moved beyond the reach of certainty. As the 10th phase closed, the case existed in a rare state, officially finished yet intellectually open, emotionally unresolved yet strangely stable in its uncertainty. It no longer demanded belief in a single version of events. It demanded patience with complexity. It demanded the humility to admit that some truths cannot be pinned down, only approached. The city carried on, unaware that the ground beneath one of its oldest mysteries had shifted again, quietly, without spectacle. Somewhere between data and memory, between conviction and doubt, the Sydney 2001 cold case continued to breathe, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, reminding anyone who listened closely that endings are often administrative, while questions, once born, have a much longer life. In the final stretch of this long, unfinished story, nothing explodes into truth. Nothing steps forward to claim the weight of all those years. Instead, the case settles into its last, most honest shape, a presence rather than a problem, a shadow that no longer chases resolution, but follows memory wherever it goes. The Sydney 2001 cold case does not conclude. It exhales. By now, everyone closest to it understands something the headlines never could. Closure was never the point. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, the reviews, the data, the theories, each was a response to discomfort, to the human need for edges, for borders around chaos. But the disappearance itself never respected those boundaries. It slipped between systems, between assumptions, between moments that looked ordinary until they weren't. And once it did, it refused to be fully retrieved. The file remains where it has always been, cataloged, accessible, dormant but not erased. Occasionally, someone new opens it, reads it straight through, and feels the same unease that has haunted everyone before them. The sense that something essential is missing, not just evidence, but alignment. That the story never quite locks into place no matter how carefully it's arranged. Those readers close the file differently than they open it, quieter, more aware how fragile certainty really is. The family lives on, not healed, not broken, but change in ways that resist description. Grief has become a background condition, like weather, sometimes mild, sometimes overwhelming, always present. They no longer wait for answers, but they do not reject them either. They understand now that truth, if it ever arrives, may not arrive with justice or relief or clarity. It may arrive as a sentence fragment, a location without context, a confirmation that explains less than it promises. They are prepared for that. They have been preparing their whole lives. The city barely speaks of the case anymore, but it still feels it, in the way people double-check doors, in the way routines are treated with caution rather than comfort, in the way disappearances are reported now, faster, louder, less patient. The case rewrote instincts. It taught a generation that silence can be dangerous, that absence is not neutral, that ordinary mornings can fracture without warning. Some nights, somewhere in Sydney, someone will still search her name, fall down the familiar trail of articles, documentaries, debates. They will read about the arrest and assume the story ended there. Others will read deeper and feel the discomfort spread, the realization that this is not a story with a solution, but with layers. They will close their browser with a question they didn't expect to carry. And that is where the case truly lives now, not in courtrooms, not in evidence lockers, but in the unanswered space it left behind, the space that resists replacement. A missing person does not vanish all at once. They echo, they imprint, they alter the shape of everything around them long after they're gone. The Sydney 2001 cold case is officially closed. The paperwork says so. The systems say so. But the truth never signed off. It never confirmed itself. It never returned what it took. It remains suspended somewhere between what is known and what is assumed, between what was decided and what was lived. There is no final reveal waiting off-screen, no last-minute confession, no hidden grave illuminated by chance. Just a city that learned how to carry a question without dropping it, and a family that learned how to live without an ending. And somewhere in the quiet space between memory and imagination, the absence remains exactly where it has always been, unresolved, unyielding, and impossible to forget. What follows after an ending is not silence, but residue, the fine dust that settles when a story has stopped moving yet refuses to disappear. Part 12 begins there, in the aftermath of everything that has already been said, when the world assumes the case has been archived, processed, understood. This is where the Sydney 2001 cold case becomes something else entirely, no longer an investigation, no longer a legal question, but a permanent distortion in the way people understand loss. Years pass without markers. No anniversaries are announced. No statements are issued. The absence no longer spikes. It hums. It lives in habits. In the way the family avoids speaking in absolutes. In the way former investigators hesitate when asked if they believe the truth is known. Belief has become an unsafe word. It implies comfort. It implies rest. No one close to this case rests easily. Occasionally, something almost happens. A call that lasts too long. A report that circulates internally before dissolving into uncertainty. A discovery that turns out to be unrelated. Each time, the machinery stirs just enough to remind everyone that the case is not dead, only dormant. Like a fault line, invisible until pressure builds, then suddenly relevant again. One former detective admits, quietly, that this case changed how he sees endings. He used to believe every story had a final page, a moment where questions collapsed into answers. Now he understands that some stories end the way they begin, with a gap, with something missing that defines everything around it. He says the hardest part was not failing to solve it, but realizing that solving it might never restore what was lost. The family reaches a point where memory becomes an act of resistance. They stop correcting inaccuracies. They stop engaging with speculation. Instead, they protect what remains personal. Stories not shared. Details not public. This, too, is a form of closure, not the kind promised by systems, but the kind carved out by survival. They keep her real, not as a case, not as a symbol, but as a person whose life extended far beyond the moment it disappeared. In academic circles, the case is cited again, this time in discussions about narrative collapse, about what happens when a society demands resolution from stories that cannot provide it. The Sydney 2001 cold case becomes an example of how truth can be fragmented, how meaning is negotiated rather than discovered. It is no longer asked what happened, but what we do when we never fully know. And still, somewhere, the possibility remains. Not hope, possibility. That one day, something small will surface. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to anchor the absence. A location, a confirmation. A single fixed point in a story made of drift. No one expects it. No one waits for it. But no one fully dismisses it either. The city continues, louder than ever, layered with lives that have no connection to the case at all. Children grow up without knowing her name. Streets are renamed. Buildings replaced. Yet the absence persists, threaded through time, untouched by progress. Cold cases don't freeze because they are forgotten. They freeze because they cannot thaw without breaking apart. This is a final truth the case leaves behind. That resolution is not guaranteed. That justice is not synonymous with understanding. That some disappearances create a gravity so strong it bends everything around them permanently. The Sydney 2001 cold case does not end. It settles. It embeds. It becomes part of the landscape, invisible but undeniable. And as long as it remains unanswered, it continues to speak, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, reminding anyone willing to listen that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only carried forward, one generation at a time, in the long, echoing silence of what never came back. By the 14th passage, the story no longer belongs to chronology at all. Time has loosened its grip, and what remains is atmosphere, a lingering pressure that settles over everything the case ever touched. The Sydney 2001 cold case now exists in fragments, scattered across memory, policy, instinct, and silence, each fragment intact on its own, impossible to assemble into a whole. There are people who swear the case changed the way the city listens. Not officially, not in any measurable metric, but in pauses, in the way conversations stop when someone doesn't arrive on time, in the way absence is no longer brushed aside as inconvenience. The disappearance taught people that vanishing does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine, cloaked in normalcy, and by the time it is recognized, it is already complete. Inside institutions, the case has become something like a ghost reference. It is not cited directly, but it shapes questions. When timelines are proposed, someone asks how certain they really are. When routines are assumed, someone else pushes back. These interventions are subtle, easily overlooked, but they exist because of this case, because once a story hardened too quickly around assumptions that felt safe until they weren't. The family moves through the world differently now, not cautiously, but attentively. They have learned that certainty is a luxury, not a guarantee. They no longer correct people who say the case was solved. They let the word pass, understanding that for many, solved simply means no longer unbearable to think about. They carry a quieter truth, one that does not fit into conversations designed to end neatly. Sometimes, a stranger recognizes them, not from recent news, but from memory, from an old headline, from a documentary watched late at night. The stranger offers sympathy or admiration or curiosity. The family responds politely, then retreats, reminded that the public version of the story has a life of its own, one that continues regardless of how much distance they put between themselves and it. Elsewhere, in places that will never make the news, the case still influences decisions. A missing persons report is taken more seriously than it might have been once. A delay is questioned sooner. A search is expanded instead of narrowed. These are not victories. They are adjustments. Small corrections made in the shadow of a failure that never fully named itself as one. The absence at the center of the case has become abstract, almost philosophical. It raises questions that resist resolution. How much proof is enough to call something finished? Who gets to decide when a story ends? Is closure something granted, or something taken by force when waiting becomes unbearable? The Sydney 2001 cold case offers no answers, only the discomfort of asking. Late at night, the city still hums. Trains move through stations rebuilt since the disappearance. Streets fill and empty. Lives intersect and separate without consequence. And somewhere within that motion, the case persists not as an event, but as a reminder that not every trajectory can be traced, not every loss mapped. There is no new evidence here, no twist waiting to be revealed. What remains is endurance, the endurance of a question that refuses to collapse under time, the endurance of a family that learned to live without a resolution that made sense. The endurance of a city that absorbed a mystery so completely it forgot it was still carrying it. By now, the cold case has outlived its original meaning. It is no longer cold because it lacks attention. It is cold because it has settled into permanence, preserved not by neglect but by uncertainty. It has become part of the background, like an old scar you only notice when the weather changes. And that may be its final form, not a warning, not a lesson neatly learned, but a quiet distortion in the way stories are told, in the way endings are trusted, a reminder that some truths do not arrive as answers, but as absences that never quite release their hold. The Sydney 2001 cold case remains what has always been beneath every label placed on it, a missing moment, a vanished life, a silence that continues to shape the sound around it. And as long as that silence endures, the story does too, unresolved not because it was abandoned, but because it was never willing to become something simple enough to end. By the 15th passage, the story has thinned to something almost weightless, and yet it presses harder than ever, because what remains now is not evidence or argument, but consequence. The Sydney 2001 cold case has done what only the most unresolved stories can do. It has altered behavior without demanding attention, reshaped instinct without announcing itself. It no longer needs witnesses. It has become one. Those who once worked closest to it notice the change most clearly. They pause longer before closing files. They hesitate before calling something unlikely. They have learned that improbability is not the same as impossibility, that the quietest outcomes can be the most final. When asked about the case now, they don't recount details. They speak in generalities, about humility, about limits, about the danger of mistaking coherence for truth. The family reaches a stage beyond endurance, beyond vigilance. What they practice now is continuity. They mark birthdays without explanation. They speak her name without context. They allow her to exist without narrative, without justification. In doing so, they reclaim something that had been taken from them early on, ownership of memory. The case can belong to institutions, to archives, to debate. Her life belongs to them. Occasionally, something threatens that equilibrium. A new article recycling old language. A documentary trailer promising answers it cannot deliver. The family no longer responds with anger. They respond with distance. They understand now that public curiosity has its own momentum, one that cannot be redirected, only outpaced by time. They step aside and let it pass. In classrooms and training rooms, the case appears again, stripped of names, reduced to scenarios. Students are asked what they would do differently. They offer confident answers. Expand the search. Question assumptions. Keep options open. Their instructors nod, knowing that confidence comes easiest before pressure arrives, before the clock starts ticking, before silence stretches into days and days into years. The case teaches its lesson slowly, long after the exam ends. The city, vast and indifferent, continues to metabolize the story. New generations inherit the infrastructure built over unanswered questions. They move through spaces unaware of what once mattered there. This is not forgetting. It is absorption. The mystery has dissolved into the environment, indistinguishable from everything else that has happened and cannot be undone. And still, the possibility persists, quieter than hope, heavier than resignation. Not that the truth will arrive, but that it might already exist somewhere, unrecognized, mislabeled, misunderstood. A fact without context. A memory without audience. A detail waiting for the right question. This possibility does not demand belief. It survives without it. By now, the case has stripped away the illusion that endings are owed. It has revealed something more unsettling and more honest, that some stories do not resolve because resolution was never part of their design. They exist to expose the seams, the places where systems falter, where certainty frays, where human need collides with human limitation. The Sydney 2001 cold case stands as one of those stories. Not dramatic in its final form, not explosive, just persistent. A reminder that disappearance is not a moment, but a condition, one that spreads outward, altering everything it touches. There will be no final chapter that explains everything. No last line that restores balance. What remains is continuation. Memory carried forward without conclusion. A silence that has learned how to endure. And in that endurance, the case achieves its most unsettling legacy, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as proof that some absences never return what they take, and some questions are not meant to be answered, only live with quietly in the long, unbroken shadow of what never came back. By the 16th movement, the story has shed even the illusion of progression. There is no forward anymore, only depth. The Sydney 2001 cold case no longer advances through time. It sinks into it, settling layer by layer until it becomes indistinguishable from the ground it rests on. What once demanded answers now demands acknowledgement. Those who encounter the case for the first time feel it differently than those who live through it. There is no shock for them, no sense of rupture. They approach it like archaeology, carefully, intellectually, aware they are touching something already concluded by others. And yet, as they dig, they feel the same resistance, the same refusal to resolve. They realize quickly that this is not a puzzle missing a final piece. It is a shape built around a hole. The language surrounding the case continues to evolve. Officials no longer say unsolved, nor do they insist on solved. They say unrecoverable, not evidence, not truth, just recovery. Something lost beyond the reach of process. The word carries no drama, no accusation. It simply states a limit. And limits, once named, change everything. The family hears this word and understands it instantly. It does not wound them the way earlier phrases did. It does not pretend. It does not promise. It acknowledges what they have known for years but were never allowed to say out loud, that some losses are not temporary states. They are permanent conditions. Naming that does not erase grief, but it does remove the cruelty of false anticipation. In private moments, they no longer replay timelines. They no longer ask, what if questions. Those have exhausted themselves. What remains are memories detached from consequence, laughter without irony, photos without analysis, a life remembered for what it was, not for how it ended or failed to end. This is not forgetting. It is reclamation. Elsewhere, the case continues to exert influence in ways no one tracks. A search is extended by a few hours. A missing persons report is escalated sooner than protocol requires. A supervisor insists on documenting uncertainty instead of smoothing it out. These decisions are never attributed to Sydney. 2001. They don't need to be. Influence does not require credit to function. Every so often, someone asks the question that has haunted the case in the beginning, but now it sounds different, stripped of urgency and expectation. Does it still matter? The answer arrives quietly, without consensus, without announcement. Yes, not because it will be solved, not because justice will change shape, but because it marks a boundary, a reminder where knowledge ends and humility must begin. The city, as always, moves forward. It does not pause for stories that refuse to finish. It absorbs them, carries them, builds around them. Somewhere beneath roads and routines, beneath conversations and forgetfulness, the case remains, unchanged, uninterested in resolution. It has no need to prove anything now. By this point, the cold case has become something almost elemental, like fog, like shadow, not an event you point to, but a condition you recognize when you feel it. A reminder that certainty is fragile, that disappearance is not rare, that silence can outlast noise. There is nothing left to uncover here, only something left to acknowledge. That the Sydney 2001 cold case did not fail because it lacked answers. It failed the idea that answers are always available, always sufficient, always capable of restoring balance. And so it persists, not as an open question, but as an open space, one that resists closure, one that reshapes anyone who steps into it, one that proves, quietly and relentlessly, that some stories are not meant to end, only to endure, unchanged, unresolved, and permanently present along, still echo of what never came back. By the 17th passage, even endurance begins to change shape. The case no longer weighs on the present. It stretches behind it, a long, quiet wake trailing everything that came after. The Sydney 2001 cold case has crossed a threshold few stories ever reach, where it is no longer remembered as an event, but as a condition inherited by people who were never there to witness it. Those who study it now do so with distance, but not detachment. They recognize the pattern immediately, the early certainty, the narrowing focus, the slow collapse into ambiguity. They can diagram it, label it, teach it, and still, when they reach the end of the file, there is a pause, a moment where analysis gives way to something less comfortable. The realization that understanding the mechanics of failure does not undo its effects. The family exists almost outside the timeline now. They are no longer moving away from the disappearance, nor toward an answer. They are simply living alongside it. The way one lives with a chronic condition that no longer surprises but never disappears. They have learned which days require preparation, which conversations to step away from, which memories to protect. Their resilience is not loud. It is practice. Sometimes they imagine how the story is told by people who never knew her, as a headline, as a case study, as a cautionary tale. They wonder what gets lost in those tellings, what softness is erased in favor of structure. They know the answer, even if they never articulate it. What gets lost is always the same thing, the ordinary texture of a life that did not exist to become a mystery. Institutions move on, but habits remain. The case has become part of the invisible architecture of decision-making. It influences how long searches last, how much uncertainty is tolerated, how quickly absence is treated as danger rather than inconvenience. These changes are never dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They appear as pauses, as questions, as reluctance to close a file too soon. This is how the case continues to work. Quietly, without permission. Every now and then, someone new becomes convinced they can solve it. They approach with confidence, armed with fresh eyes and old data. They rearrange timelines, challenge assumptions, chase overlooked details. For a while, the case feels alive again, responsive, almost hopeful. Then it does what it has always done. It absorbs the effort and gives nothing back, not out of malice, out of consistency. The city carries this rhythm without noticing. It has learned how to coexist with unresolved stories. It does not demand answers from them anymore. It lets them exist as background noise like traffic, like weather. The case surfaces occasionally in conversation, usually late, usually quiet, when certainty feels especially fragile. Then it recedes again. What remains most striking after all this time is not what is unknown, but what is accepted, that some disappearances do not leave footprints that can be followed, that some truths are not hidden, just unreachable, that the absence of an answer does not always indicate failure, only limit. By now, the cold case has done its final transformation. It has stopped asking anything of the future. It has stopped waiting. It has become a fixed absence, a reference point against which other stories measure themselves. Not as warning, not as lesson, as reality. And in that reality, the Sydney 2001 cold case continues exactly as it always has, unchanged by verdicts or reviews or reinterpretations. A life interrupted, a moment left open, a silence that never needed resolution to prove its power. There is nothing left to add, no revelation waiting beyond the next page, only the quiet understanding that some stories do not end because they were never meant to. They remain, not to be solved, but to remind, lingering in the background of everything, steady and unresolved, in the long, unbroken echo of what never came back.